fiscal situations than most of these supposedly irresponsible Southern European countries are not facing the big interest penalties for bankruptcy because they're not going to default. They may inflate, but that's not the same thing as default. Whereas Greece, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Ireland, they all might default, and that would be very messy, and investors are very scared of it. So I think for the U.S., we have problems in getting our politicians to recognize the budget constraint and actually talk about it. But we have the institutions. It's clear who should be making the decisions. Mm-hmm. In Europe, the problem is the institutions that should be making the decisions don't really exist. They're being constructed on the fly. And that's why their problem is a lot harder than ours.
Well, let me turn to a question or two that your colleagues would like to raise. Your grandfather probably foresaw that he wouldn't be able to ask you all the interesting questions. So what do you see as the strengths and weaknesses of the use of nonlinear methods in structural and non-structural macroeconometrics? And do you foresee increased use of nonlinear methods in empirical macro research in the future? Typical economist question, right? So
I don't really think of it as nonlinear versus linear. I think that that we have pushed the linear Gaussian model a long way, and that it's partly the fault of econometricians and macroeconomists that we didn't look hard enough at the data before this crisis. We got comfortable with linear models with interest rates, money, prices, and output, maybe employment in them. And if you actually look with non-structural methods at financial stress indicators like interest rate spreads and volatility of financial variables, those variables were important and helped predict before 2008. They have some marginal predictive power in the late 70s when the economy was very unstable. And so if you fit a vector autoregression through 2007 with those variables in it, it actually helps you. Even though you don't have the coefficients from 2008, it would have helped give a better set of predictions through 2008. Not much advanced warning, but maybe a quarter or two. So I think we should be modeling stochastic volatility, thinking about the shape of the tails of distributions, looking for interactions that are not linear, just linear. At a minimum, it should be a standard now that the time-varying variances ought to be there in all our models. And we have the computational capacity now to go beyond these linear models. Of course, there's many different directions to go, and we haven't yet figured out what are the most important kinds of non-Gaussianity, non-linearity, time instability to allow for. But we need to do that. We need to do it in a non-structural way so that the theoretical macroeconomists who are always building theories to match VARs without admitting it, we got to get the standard VAR stylized facts to include a more richer array of things so that their theories stop being irrelevant.
Here's a question from my broker. He is very interested in switching money back and forth between Treasury bills and S&P 500 index. And I'm sure he would be interested in what leading indicators you would suggest to him that would allow him to determine when to go to equities from Treasury bills or to Treasury bills from equities. Do you have any sweet spot indicators we can use in our investments?
Well, I don't believe in the efficient markets hypothesis, but I do believe that markets are more efficient than I am. So I don't really have any advice to give on that kind of a
So
question.
you're not a timing adherent, right?
No.
Is that
Right.
all right? Well, you just believe in diversification and living a long time. Is that
That's right.
correct?
That's
okay.
right.
Well, we'll work on that. Let me sort of give you a quote here that a colleague gave me, and it had something to do with lose your inhibitions, put probabilities on parameters without embarrassment. Now, this is the notion that you have strongly advocated in recent years, the use of Bayesian econometric methods. And we know that there's sort of two approaches to characterizing uncertainty, and that is the classic approach or frequentist approach and the Bayesian approach. So how have your views changed on this duality in decision making? Are you moving one direction or the other, and why would you propose that the direction you're moving in is the right direction?
I don't think of there being a separate category of Bayesian estimation methods. The Bayesian approach is a way of looking at data and using it. I also don't think there are two ways to characterize uncertainty. Bayesian methods characterize uncertainty. Frequentist methods characterize uncertainty before you look at the data. And all the probability distributions they give are pre-sample probability distributions. Sometimes things like confidence intervals or hypothesis tests give you answers that you can show are roughly the same as what you would get if you actually put probability conditional on the data on various unknown things. And that's when frequentist methods are useful. But sometimes they're quite different, and then I don't understand what you could use a confidence interval or a hypothesis test for if you can't back it up by saying it's a characterization of uncertainty conditional on the data. My view of the Bayesian approach is that it'll take anybody's estimate or estimation method and try to say, well, okay, you're giving me these statistics. You're calling this an estimator, you're calling this a confidence interval, you're calling this a standard error of an estimate. Given those things, what do I believe about the distribution of the things that I'm still uncertain about? I'm no longer uncertain about these estimators. I don't care about their distribution before I calculated them. I care about the things I still don't know, which are the true parameters, conditional on those statistics. That's the Bayesian approach. And it doesn't matter how you generated the statistics. You can, no matter what statistics somebody presents you with, you can ask, what's a sensible way to construct a conditional distribution of the things you still don't know, given the things, the functions of the data you're presented with? So I think, and once you get that basic point, it clarifies a lot of thinking, in my view. And it isn't tied to any. It's true that once you have this point of view, there are methods that kind of grow directly out of it. And one of the reasons Bayesian methods were a minority approach for a long time is that a lot of their proponents insisted on building up methods with finite parameter models that were not very flexible because computation was hard in those days. And so it looked like you had to use very different models if you were a Bayesian. But actually, any estimator, you can ask, is there a way to justify that as at least an approximation to a conditional mean or a conditional median given the information in the data? And that's the kind of question we should be asking.
Well, as you know, there was a Nobel Prize awarded, I think in 2004, to Tversky and to Kahneman in behavioral economics. And in 2003 or 4, I think you wrote an article on the rationality of inattention. Do you see, how do you see this contribution playing into macroeconomic theory, macroeconomic policy making?
Well, the these approaches, behavioral finance and rational inattention, they're reactions to the success of rational expectations modeling. Before rational expectations modeling, there was a lot of kind of ad hoc modeling of behavior that didn't take account of some dynamic intertemporal constraints, and that ignored the fact that people had expectations of the future and that these mattered. But rational expectations pursued ruthlessly leads you to some untenable positions. It's saying that everybody is constantly aware of and reacting to all information all the time. And we know that's not true. And we know some of the first good empirical studies of rational expectations models started rejecting the models. We know that they're the classic Hansen, can't remember the co-author, study of asset markets. As soon as Hall did his rational expectations permanent income, within a very short time, lots of people were showing you could actually predict consumption, which contradicts rational expectations. So, and what's ended up is our models are still rational expectations models, but to account for all the sluggishness and randomness in behavior, we put in adjustment costs all over the place. And that affects our evaluations of policy. So I think it would be good if we could be more explicit about where the sluggishness in behavior was coming from, and use that to when we do optimal policy evaluations. For the time being, it's very hard to do that. Kahneman and Tversky were mostly documenting deviations from strict rationality. Rational inattention says, well, here's a very particular deviation from fully informed rationality that takes account that models individuals as if they're finite Shannon capacity channels when they take market signals and map them into their own behavior. That's a very powerful metaphor, and it explains a lot with one simple principle, but it's mathematically difficult to implement, and it's clear that it doesn't cover every kind of irrationality. So my view is that for the time being, these theories, the theorists are working on them, getting very excited about them. For empirical work, there are a few people like Mashkowiak and Wiederholt who are really trying to build macro models with this stuff in them explicitly. But I think more generally, we should just be less embarrassed about using models that deviate from rational expectations, and treating rational expectations as a rough guide to the structure of models, and not being embarrassed about it turning out that a model we actually want to use for forecasting or predicting the effects of policy is not exactly a rational expectations model.
Well, I'm going to ask one more question that I know your grandfather would